All right, in this video, we're going to pick right up from where we left off in part one of the material design list. And I debated on how to go through this. And the way I'm going to go through this with you is I'm going to walk you through step by step of this flow control from the original one that I had instead of going back and recreating this from scratch. I actually attempted to recreate this from scratch and it just ended up turning into like a 45-minute video even after editing. So I think going through this step by step with one that's already complete will get the idea across to you, and I can show you all these pieces. So I have three screenshots of this entire task already over here so that you can have a look at it as we go through it. I have some reminders down here at the bottom. This is stuff that we talked about in part one, so that's just there to serve as a reminder as well. Now, the toot list is the one that I created or back in part one, but basically this one here obviously is a lot more. We still have that configuration set up here, and then I have some extra things. Every time we run this task, I have it flashing to me telling me how many items I have in a global variable list. A global variable, notice this %MD list, and you can see the same thing right over here. What we're going to be doing here is we have to create a global variable list so that we can maintain and store the values that are the items that we have in our list. The %LS list that I've talked about back in part one, that's going to be a local variable in Tasker, and every time this thing is run, every time we run this task, that %LS list gets reset. So we have to actually store these items as a global. That way we can maintain these items and have them show back up each time we run this task. So that's what I have flashing right here, and I'll show you what it says. You have %MD list with a pound sign inside of the parentheses, items in your list. Basically, this is going to return how many items we have in our list. And it's going to show us that every time we run this task. If you don't want that there, you don't have to have it. A lot of these flashes are unnecessary, but they're there for teaching purposes. And it's going to allow me to show you where we are in our flow control. Now let's go to configuration for this list activity, and let me show you one thing that you do need to change. For the items in your list, you need to use %MD list with the parentheses. I think we put bread, milk, or something in the previous video. Well, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be using that global variable, that global array. That's going to get stored and it's going to get returned to us every time. So make sure you go ahead and change that right there. Now, back in our flow control, the first thing we want to talk about here. So when we run this list activity, we open it up and suppose we press the back button. Now remember, you want to use the back button if you want to back out of it. Never use the home button. That's going to freeze this task, and if I ever find a fix for it, I'll post that. But anyway, if you open this thing up and you press the back button, that's going to be the ls command dismiss that I discussed back in part one. Well, if you press that, we don't want anything to happen. So notice I have a flash here that says no changes were made, and again, you can see that right over here as well. So let's just go ahead and run that, and let's see that we're going to press the back button, no changes are going to be made. Then what's going to happen? It's not going to run any of this else stuff here. It's not going to run this else stuff here. As you can see, I have 11 over to here. It's not going to run any of this, none of this, none of this, and it's going to go straight to end. Only thing we're going to see here is that it's going to say no changes were made. None of this else stuff is not going to be run, and then it's going to be sending these variables over to KLWP. So let's check that out. So I've opened it up. Notice it says you have 0 items in your list. That's that first part of the flow control. And if I press the back button, it says no changes were made. And that's the only thing that's going to happen in all this if, else, if, whatever, all this crazy stuff you see. It's just going to go straight down here to the end where we send over the number of variables. I'll show this to you when we get there. It's going to send over the list and it's going to stop this task. So that's what these last 3 pieces over here that I have. Now, what if we do something else? Suppose we don't hit the back button. Well, let's talk about, okay, else. No changes were made, we saw that. Else, we're going to see this, the list before flow control. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that one, number 6. The list before flow control. This is the local variable. So this is going to flash quickly to us the items that we have in our list. And it's also going to flash to us the number of items, but this is going to be before we do all the flow control. So let's go ahead and get this to run right now. Now this is where we're going to have to do a little bit of work, and it's all done in the flow control, but let's go ahead and run it anyway. Suppose I press play. I'm going to accept this, and when I accept this, you're thinking, okay, well, we shouldn't have any items in our list. Well, the plugin adds an item, and you're going to see that right now. Notice it says %ls list 1, and it said the number of items in your list were 1. Let's play that one more time. And you saw 3 flashes there. It's saying that we have an item in our list. Well, let's check out and see what happens. So we got this flash that flashed up. It said the list before flow control, and it showed %ls list with the 1. It's adding an item there even though we don't have one. And then it also flashed the number of items in this list, and it said a 1 right there even though we thought we didn't have any. So that's why we're seeing that, because we did not press the back button. We did not press this, so it's running this here. The next step, okay, if you read this, it says if %ls list pound, this is the number of items in our list, if it equals 0, well, that's not going to happen. So we're not going to see some of this stuff in here. You may notice I have a label. I'm going to come back to that in a second. That no items, we'll see that in a second. But it's not going to run this because the number of items in our local variable list is not equal to 0. So it's going to come down here and it's going to go to this part. So else, it's going to clear, and you'll see why we're doing this later on, but it's going to clear our global variable array list, MD list. It's going to take the list that we have, even though we thought we didn't have anything in it, it's going to take that local variable list and we're going to store it temporarily as a %temp list. So let me show you how I'm doing these. We're inside of this else statement. We'll come back up here to this in a minute. So array clear, you actually select that action and you tell it what array you want to clear. Do not use parentheses there. Variable set, you want to set, this is a local variable, temp list, and we're going to set that equal to that array, that local array that we have, that's the items in our list. The reason why we're doing this is that if you ever decide to use commas to add multiple items at one time, like I did back at the beginning in part 1, then we want to be able to re-separate these pieces by commas so that we can separate those items when we open our list back up. Go back and check out part 1, you'll see what I'm talking about there. But we're going to create a string or a variable with words and numbers and commas, and we're going to set that equal to whatever we have from our ls list, our local variable. Backing out of there, what we're going to do next is we're going to take that local variable we just created based on our array list, and we're going to split it up based on commas. When you split it up based on commas, it's automatically going to make this an array. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking an array, we're storing it as a variable, and then we're going to split that variable right back up with commas. What this is going to allow you to do again, if you added multiple items at one time and you separated them with a comma, like I did back at part 1, this is what's going to treat each individual item as its own item, and it's going to make it show up on a separate row when we rerun this plugin. I'm going to show that to you right here in a second. Now we have to do a for loop. In this for loop, number 15, we have to do the following. For %keep, you're creating another local variable. Again, this is just a temporary variable. It's going to get wiped out. All local variables get wiped out every time you run a task. And what we're going to do, this new local array that we've created, and it's created it based on all these commas, we're going to set a variable %keep, and we're going to let that be equal to each individual item in this temp list array that we just created. Because remember, we separated it by commas. When you separate a variable in Tasker by commas, it's going to automatically create an array. So notice I'm using the little parentheses here from my array. And no matter how many items you have in here, %keep is going to be equal to the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one, the sixth one, etc. No matter how many items you have in here. And it's going to quickly look through all these items, and it's going to push these items into our MD list. If you recall, we cleared our list back at the beginning of this part of our flow control. But the only time we want to push them into this global array list, the only time we want to push them in there is if %keep does not match regex, doesn't match regex, that's the one you want to pick, %ls. A moment ago, when I was accepting a blank list, you noticed that sometimes it did show a variable %ls list 1 or %ls list 2. Well, what we want to do is we want to get rid of those, and that's what's going to happen here. That %keep, again, a moment ago, the for loop was for %keep. We're going to let that be each individual item in that temp list array that we made. Each one of those items, we want to push it into the first position of our variable array MD list. Don't use parentheses there. It can be a little bit confusing as when you use them and when you don't use them. I understand that. But the only time you want to push that value in there is if it doesn't match the regex %ls. Now you could have wrote %ls underscore list here, but this right here, I just decided to do it like that. It's shorter typing, and basically if it sees, if any of these keep items have this in it, %ls, basically you can't type %ls if you want to add an item to your list, but are you really going to do that? So, well, after we do that, we have to run another if statement inside of this flow control, because sometimes that may be the only items we had on our list, like you saw a moment ago. And this is where we're getting ready to see this other parts of this flash when I rerun this part again. We're going to end our for loop, and now we want to ask ourselves, okay, well, what if this variable, this global variable array that we had supposedly pushed items into, that's what we did here in this for loop, if that's equal to 0, then basically what we've done is the following. There were some ls list items in that array. They were removed, and actually they were the only ones. They were the only ones in that list. Therefore, let's see what happens. So therefore, now we want to go to what? Action label no items. Now, if you haven't used Tasker a lot, labeling parts of your task is very helpful for you to go back to a certain part. So I want to go to an action label of no items. Well, let's scroll back through here and see where we have no items. No items is labeled right here. It's going to jump back to this part, and it's going to flash no items in your list. Now, I know this is crazy, but we're not running this and this when we go back to this part. I just wanted to go to that part. I could have easily have done the following. Instead of telling it to go to here, I could have just flashed no items in list. I could have flashed that right there. But if you're getting used to Tasker, that's a very important tool to use, is labeling parts of your task if you want to go back and redo something, or do like a for loop, or just any type of loops. Sometimes it's good to go back to a certain label that you have set up in your task somewhere. So again, I could have just flashed no items in list. Now, let's make all of this run one more time so that you can see all those flashes. So what we're going to see again is we're going to see this flash up, and we're going to have no items in our list. We're not going to press the dismiss key, so it's going to jump to here. It's going to flash the list before flow control, and it's going to give us a ls list 1. This is what's going to happen when we run this, because I'm just going to accept a blank list, and it's going to add an item in here, and it's going to be called %ls list 1. Therefore, it's going to be one item in the list. So since we know we have one item in our list, we're going to skip this if part right here, because %ls list pound, the number of items, is not going to be equal to 0. So we're skipping this. We're going to come down here to the else part. It's going to clear our global array, even though there's nothing in there to begin with. The reason why we want to do that is every time we want to recreate this list, so that if we did delete stuff, it's getting cleared and we're re-adding the new stuff only. That's important there, trust me. We're setting that ls list to a temp list. We're going to separate it by commas should you have added more items with commas. We're going to run this for loop that I went over with you, and then we're going to see the following. Once we run this, if the only item in our ls list, which we converted to temp list, if the only items in it had a %ls, none of those items are going to get pushed to %md list. Therefore, md list is going to be equal to 0. So finally, we're going to see this flash here. %ls list items will be removed. Therefore, that's what it had there. We're going to go back to this action label that we labeled no items, and it's going to flash no items in your list. So there's the flow control for this. Let's see that in action. I'm playing. I have no items in my list. I'm going to press check and watch these flashes that come up. Did you see that? All three of those flashes that I was talking about. Well, for how many ever? We had this one, then we had the list before flow control, blah, 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 blah. As you notice, it did show one item. So it's skipping over this because we didn't have 0 items in our list. And then it went down to here and it ended up, now it does this stuff very fast. You may think this takes forever, but it doesn't. And then we saw this thing, %ls list items will be removed. And then it took us back to the action label, no items. And that's one right there. So we saw no items in your list. All right, let's add some items to our list. I'm going to play. Now what I've done here right off the bat is I've added 3 items, but it's only showing up as 1 item. By us doing the temp list piece right here, because it's going to run this again, and you're going to understand why right here in a second. By us doing this, when it runs this temp list and ls list stuff, it's going to actually end up creating 3 items on our list, and you're going to see that right here in a second. But let me go ahead and add one more as well. And then I'm going to add one more. Now basically what I'm showing you here is that essentially when this is all said and done, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 items in our list. However, when we first play this, it's going to flash back to us that we have 3 items in our list. This one, and this one. But again, the temp list piece here, since we have commas, that's going to take care of separating the 1, the 2, and the 3 and creating 3 separate items. And then also this for loop, it's going to remove any of these items in here that match regex or doesn't match. If it does not match %ls, which this one does, it's not going to get pushed into the MD list. But this one's going to get pushed, this one's going to get pushed, this one's going to get pushed, and that one is. But this one will not. Let's go ahead and accept this and see what flashes up. So what you saw there were, what, 3 flashes, I think? No, just 2 flashes, my bad. We already saw that flash before we ran this. So we didn't press the back button, so it's skipping over that. But you did notice that it flashed this, the list before flow control, and it showed all of those items in the list. And I think it was a 1, 2, 3 for 1 item, a 4, and then it was a %ls list, but I think it actually showed an additional one as well. But anyway, the point is the following. If we go back and rerun this in a minute, you're going to see that that ls list should be removed is getting removed, and here's why. It's skipping over this because the ls list was not equal to 0, the number of items in our list, so it's skipping over that. So it's going to run this now, the same thing I went over with you. It's going to clear out our global array. It's going to store that temp list. It's going to separate it by commas, and this is what's allowing us to take the 1, 2, 3 and actually create 3 different items, and we'll see that right here in a minute when I rerun this. Now, it's going to start pushing. We had a %keep, another temporary local variable, that we're looking at each item in this temp list that's separated by commas. That's an array. And we're pushing the items over into our global array, which is cleared now. It's going to get cleared every time, all right? The reason why we want to clear it every time again is so that if we had old items that got removed, whatever, it's going to remake this list each time. Now we should not see the ls should be removed because that's what this regex here is taking care of. So it's going to end that for loop. And now we're going to skip over this because since we had some items in our list that were not just the %ls stuff, it's going to skip over this because it says if %md list pound equals 0. Well, it doesn't equal 0 now. So what is it going to do? It's going to do this else part. Array process, that's another action. We want to take this global array, this %md list, and we want to reverse it. And the reason why you want to do this is it's going to maintain the same order that we had. The reason why this happens is because we're pushing items into the array and we're pushing them to position 1. So essentially what's happening there too behind the scenes is that it's reversing those items that we just added to our list. Now you don't really have to do that, but if you want to maintain the same order, then yes, you do need to reverse your list. And again, it's another powerful tool in Tasker that we can use to manipulate items in our array. So array process, you want to process that array and we want to reverse it. And there's various things you can do, but reverse is what I'm picking here. And then if you notice, the last flash that we saw was list task complete. All right, now the only thing we haven't seen here, now ifs, end if, end if, end if. You want to make sure you're using enough of these end ifs. And the reason why I got so many of them is because I got an if, here, we got one here, we got one here, we got one here. You want to make sure all of these things line up. And that way it knows to jump out of that if statement whenever it comes down and hits one. Now, the only thing we haven't seen inside of this is the following. We have not seen where the %ls list is equal to 0. So let me show you how this pops up and why I had to include that in the flow control. Now remember, %md list, our global array, now has some items inside of it. It should be a 1, 2, 3, and then the word spelled out 4, F-O-U-R. Let's play it. As you can see, it's exactly what we have here. And it's in the order that we added them, with the exception of the 1, 2, 3, but hopefully you'll be okay with that. I mean, if you're just making a quick to-do list, hopefully order does not matter too much. But anyway, what's missing? %ls, whatever I typed in, should be removed. That was an item. It's not there because that's what this for loop is taking care of. So now what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to clear my list. And now when I accept this, this is the one time when %ls list pound will be equal to 0. So we should see the flash number of items in ls list equals 0. But we're not going to see that just yet. The first thing you're going to see is the list before flow control. It's going to be 0 items. And you're going to see a 0 pop up from this flash. Then you're going to see number of items in ls list equals 0. And then what it's going to do here is it's going to clear our global array, because technically we did clear our list. So we want to make sure we clear our global array. And we're also going to see the flash no items in your list. So those exact 3 flashes were exactly what we just saw there. This is already a relatively long video. Imagine me trying to go in here and type all these things out and show it to you, but I know it can be hard to follow. I understand that totally. I mean, when I was making this, it was a whole bunch of trial and error, but this is the thought process I had to go through to take care of the %ls list. That was the main thing. That for loop was a big deal because that's getting rid of the %ls variables that the plugin automatically adds in when we think it shouldn't be getting added in. And I don't have an answer as to why it's doing that, but I got a way to get rid of it. Also down here at the bottom, after all of our end ifs, we're sending over 2 variables to KLWP. One of them is going to be count. And this is going to be helpful in the last part, part 3 that I make, when we actually create this array in KLWP or create this list in KLWP. So I'm calling that variable count, and what am I actually sending over? All I'm doing is sending over the count. How many items do I have in my global array? %md list with the pound. Again, that always will return how many items or the number of items you have in your array. So this is what we'll use inside of KLWP when we get to that part of the tutorial. We're also sending over the actual list itself. So KLWP send variable, I had that set to my list, and that's just sending over all of those items. And once we do all that, I always like to, by practice, good practice, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary, but I just want to do one of my last pieces down here is stop whatever this task is. So I have it set to stop, and you can actually, I think, search right here, and you can tell it what to stop. And in this case, the name of our task is material design list. So I'm telling it to stop all this junk. So I've walked you through the pieces. Now, again, I understand that this can be really hard to follow because of these if-else's, but it can get really involved when you have multiple things going on. And in this case, a to-do list, you're adding items, you're taking away items. Let me show you this to kind of bring it all together. I'm going to add some items real quick. So what we have here are 1, 2, 3, 4 items. Let's see what flashes up. Actually says 5. We got a %ls list 5. Did you see that? A %ls list 5 was automatically added into that when I had 4 items on that list. Yes, some of them were separated by commas too, but it's adding a %ls list, and it's 5, the 5th item in that array. Well, by us doing all of this flow control, when it gets down to here, it's getting rid of that %ls. Anything that has a %ls in it, it's going to not worry about pushing it to our global array. Also right here, you remember how I had the hard comma to or whatever, I had a comma separating certain items. This right here is what's taking care of those commas and actually creating individual items on our array here. So if I play this one more time, now, yes, I know this is hard to understand. So that's the part where it can get a little bit unreversed on you, but I did want to show you at least we did get rid of the LS5, LS list 5, and it took this part here that I had separated by commas, and it did make them all their own individual item in that list. And now once I can get inside of here, swiping away. If you start swiping away like this, this is going to be the one time, to my knowledge, I don't think we're going to get that %LS list return. So we have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these two right here as well. So yes, I know, or no, I yes, whatever. If we check this, it's going to keep just those three. So some weird stuff going on in there. It's not getting rid of any LS list items because there's none in there. But if I go back and play this, notice we have the exact same three items. And that all revolves around the very beginning of this tutorial when at the list activity, we change the items in our list to %MD list with the parentheses. So that global variable is maintaining its values. Essentially, we're clearing it out every single time just about that we do this, with the exception of pressing the back button. The back button's not changing a daggone thing, but every other time we're clearing this array out, we're essentially creating a new one, even though we don't really know that. It looks the same to us sometimes. And there you have it. You know, that's part 2. That's the meat and potatoes of what makes this thing work. In part 3, we will explore how to get this to show up in KLWP and how to break them apart and put little dashes or whatever you want to put out in front of it on your component. And that's it for this video. I hope it helped.